Tonight we're going to return to the book of Romans. You may want to open your Bible to Romans chapter 1. This is that epistle that Paul wrote to the saints in Rome while he was spending that winter in Corinth, knowing he wouldn't be able to go there. He'll send it by Phoebe to his friends in Rome that would read it to the Christians there while he was on his way to Jerusalem. Now, we're always going to begin with this sentence. And we'll be doing this throughout the Bible Bowl. And it's kind of like a map, sort of like an outline, but kind of like a map, so we can keep up with where we are in the book of Romans. Paul, to all who are in Rome, that's the first part, Romans chapter 1. But then we come to the latter part of Romans chapter 1. And he begins talking about how all have sinned. Now he's going to do this in the latter part of Romans 1, all the way through Romans 2, and a little more than halfway through Romans chapter 3. And so for the next 3 or 4 Sunday nights, we're going to be right here on those 3 words. All have sinned. And this is why this is important. Paul is going to be talking to them about the gospel, and by showing that all have sinned and the enormity and the tragedy of sin, it's going to show us the need for that gospel. Now, I've broken it down here into these 4 sections. This part about the wrath of God. The wrath of God against the unrighteous. That's the latter part of Romans chapter 1. When we get to Romans chapter 2, it's going to be the wrath of God against the self-righteous. And then he's specifically going to apply that to those self-righteous Jews. And the conclusion of all of this, at the end, he's going to open it back up and show, so we've all sinned. We've all sinned. And that's why we all need the gospel. Now let's go to this wrath of God against the unrighteous. Let me break that one down, and then we'll get into the text. I've got this divided this way. We're going to show how that they are without excuse. And I want to point out right here, sometimes there's explanations for sin. People can explain it. Well, I can explain why I did that. And that might be good explanations. But let's remember, explanations do not excuse. And sometimes it's good to find the explanations. If we can explain maybe why we are doing something wrong, maybe we can figure out what we can change so that we won't be doing that anymore. So there's a need, there's an understanding and a use to being able to explain, but no explanation excuses. They're without excuse. And it says they gave up on God. That's what we're going to show. God revealed himself as he wanted men to conceive him. They didn't want to think of God that way. They gave that up for their own imaginations. And so God gave them up. That's one of the frightening things we're going to learn about the wrath of God tonight in this first chapter is God will give up on you. You want to do what's wrong? He'll let you do it. Go ahead. Go ahead. Maybe that's the way you'll find out just how terrible this wrong is. Just go ahead. I'll give up on you. You go do it and see for yourself. And so God gives up on man. Now, he's going to give man up to uncleanness and to vile affections and to reprobate minds, which is really just 3 ways of describing the depravity to which man can bring himself. God's going to give man up to those things. So let's get into the text now. I want you to notice when we were concluding in Romans 1, 17 and 18, And you may want to make a little note of this in your Bible, make a little mark or something. In Romans 1:17, it talks about the righteousness of God is revealed. Now, it's going to be revealed in the gospel, how God can be righteous and save man. That's specifically what's revealed in the gospel. But God's righteousness is God's justice. And God is just. And that's not just revealed in the gospel that He's just. But then go to Romans 18, and it says, the wrath of God is revealed. It's a frightening thing to think about the wrath of God. You might remember the second psalm right there in the end where it says, kiss the Son, lest He be angry with thee, and His wrath is kindled but a little. You don't want to make God mad. And God does get angry. In fact, there's places in the Old Testament where it says, his anger wax hot. And how do we understand the wrath of God? When we understand, doesn't the Bible say God is love? And we could almost substitute in that word also. God is grace. The loving kindness and the goodness and the grace and the beneficial God. How can this God be a God of wrath? And you may have struggled with that yourself, but I'll tell you what helped me understand this. Well, we had children. Now, I'll tell you, your children, if you want to understand the wrath of God, you need to try to raise some children. Now, I know when I looked up and I was looking around, I see children misbehaving. I don't like that. I don't like that. And it might really bother me. But I tell you, when I see my child do it, it doesn't just bother me. I'm angry. I would get more angry at my children for misbehaving than all the other children I'd see misbehaving. Why would that be? It's because I love them. And I loved all these children, but not like I love my children. And my very wrath toward my children was a part of my love for them. I tell you, look at how frustrated God must be when He wants to bless us. He wants to take pride in us. He wants to give us good things, and then look what we do. And now He can't do that. We have spoiled it for Him by our wicked behavior. And it's because He loves us. And He becomes so angry with that. And if you remember how you would become angry with your children, you understand that then. It's a part of the love of God. And I know my children found out pretty quick they didn't want to make Daddy mad, and it helped them behave. And we don't want to anger God. Now, the wrath of God is revealed. Here it is. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness. Now, I'll make the suggestion that I read and as I studied over these things. Ungodliness has to do with God. That is, doing behavior that is really in rebellion against God. Unrighteousness may have more to do with behavior against our fellow man. And so failing to behave appropriately toward God and then failing to behave appropriately toward one another may be what's captured in those words. Ungodliness, you see the word God there, ungodliness and unrighteousness. And then it says they hold the truth in unrighteousness. Now, we're to hold fast the form of sound words. That's one way to hold, but that's not this word hold. This word hold means to suppress, to hold down, or to hold back. The truth about God and who He is spread abroad in this world is good for this world and good for man. But that truth is suppressed and hindered and held back by man's misbehavior. And so that's the significance of them. You might say who hold down the truth or suppress the truth by their unrighteousness. And they didn't have an excuse. Look at these. They knew better. Look at those words. It may be known. Manifest. Showed it. Clearly seen. Understood. They knew better than this. Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them. God hath showed it unto them. For the invisible things of the creation are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. They're without excuse. They could not claim ignorance of who God was. If they were ignorant, it was a willing ignorance. They didn't want to know who God was, and so they refused that. It's also good here to see that these things are clearly seen and understood. I have it here. Yeah, the invisible things. Invisible things are clearly seen. How do you clearly see invisible things? Well, the seeing here is not the seeing with the physical eyes, it's the understanding with the mind. Like sometimes somebody explains something and says, oh, I see. It's not that you suddenly receive physical sight, but now you understood. And there are invisible attributes of God that we can clearly comprehend by looking at things that are made. It's going to list 3 of them. It lists it like there's 2, but I'll divide this into 3. His eternal power and Godhead. Now, that's not something physical you can see with physical eyes, but you can see that. His eternity. Let's say that be number 1. God is eternal. And you know, the ancient philosophers had already understood that. There was an immortality to the gods. How did they come up with the idea that the gods were eternal and that God was eternal? They did it by looking at this world. Nothing in this physical world is eternal. It's all decaying. It's all rotting. It's all rusting. It's all eroding. And they were able to see from the things of this world that this world is not eternal. And so this world didn't create itself. It had to be something eternal that created this material, decaying world. And the way they could see this was by using their reason. God made us to be intelligent creatures, and we can use logic and reason, and through that come to an understanding of truths that aren't readily evident until we have thought them through. And then they're clearly seen, like the eternity of God, His power. You see the power of God in the things that are made. That big old sun rolling up that's going to roll up out of here in the morning, how that sun can come up and what it can do to this earth and the power of those sun's rays. And then you think of the storms and the lightning and the waves of the sea and the mighty wonders of nature. It's a powerful God behind all those powers that we see in the things created. And then there's this word that's a little strange word because it's not used much, I think it's the only place it's found in the Bible, and it's not used much outside of the Bible, but it's His Godhead. That's the way the word is translated. It has to do with God's authority. And it's an authority that could only reside in someone who is God. It's the eternal God that made this temporal world. It's the powerful God that made these powerful forces of nature. And He's in control of it. He's the authority of these things. And they all respond according to His will. And it is a type of authority that could only exist in God Himself. Now that's clearly understood. And those ancient philosophers, you go back, if you could read Plato and Aristotle and some of these other philosophers of ancient Greece, and you can get lost. And they had a lot of strange ideas, but some of these ideas about God, they had reasoned correctly about that and understood some things of the nature of God by what they were able to see. Now, they didn't like it. They didn't like what they understood about God. And so they abandoned those ideas. Because when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God. Neither were they thankful, and I think that's significant. Thankful. We ought to be thankful that this God that has all this power and has all this authority has been so good to us. We should be thanking God. They weren't thankful. They took God for granted. And they didn't glorify Him as this eternal, powerful, authoritative God. They didn't glorify Him that way. They became vain in their imaginations. They just thought up their own stuff. They just imagined things, and they thought their imaginations were wonderful. They were wedded to their own ideas. And they were empty. That's what the word vain is. They just thought of a bunch of empty stuff and replaced what they could have known about God with just empty-headed ideas of their own creation. It says they were foolish heart was darkened. You see, God will give us a better heart if we'll glorify Him and thank Him and acknowledge who He is. But if we turn away from the knowledge that we have of God, our heart will become dark and we will become evil. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And can't we see that as a problem today? These fellas that have all this education and they think they are so smart and they think they are so wise and they believe some of the most foolish things. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and then they turned to idolatry. They changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like the corruptible man. They'd worship these images. They'd make God look like a person, like a man. And then that wasn't good enough. They didn't stop there. They made a God, made him look like a bird. And then they made him look like a beast. You remember that four-footed beast, that golden calf? And then they made him look like creeping things, like the reptiles. And that degrades the idea of who God is. That does not glorify God, but that does demonstrate man's contempt for God's authority, doesn't it? And then God gave them up. It's going to be that way. I'm going to give up. You're going to have to see how bad this gets, and I'll give you up to uncleanness. Sometime I remember when I was growing up, a word we'd say when things weren't going right and things were said that shouldn't have been said, and somebody say, "That's dirty." You ever heard a dirty joke? That's uncleanness. That's what we're talking about. Moral uncleanness. Did it through the lust of their own hearts. Man not following his mind, his spiritual mind to find God. Just following the lust of their own hearts to the gratification of their flesh, degrade themselves as beasts. And it says they dishonor their own bodies between themselves. Dishonor their bodies. Now I know that our bodies are sown in dishonor and raised in honor and in glory. I know that because these they're going to wax old and decay and can become dishonorable. But that's not what this is talking about. This is talking about those who deliberately do that to themselves. I'm going to be very careful what I say here, because I know it's not the work of a preacher to try to convince everyone of their own opinions and their own scruples and their own ideas about things. And I don't want to do that tonight. I've got my own ideas about some things that I may never share in this pulpit. And I may just share them under a few little company. And it's all right. Everybody can have their own ideas about some things. But I do want to talk just a little bit now about tattoos. And I know there's different opinions about tattoos. And just because I may not like a tattoo doesn't make it bad. I know that. But you know as well as I do that there are those who have dishonored their bodies with tattoos. A tattoo's not a tattoo is not a tattoo, is it? There's some that are just, well, they're embarrassing. And they're so degrading. Lori and I were talking the other day about how when we grew up, our parents wouldn't let us do it, but you could pay money and go see the tattooed man or the tattooed woman. You know, you don't have to pay any money now. I mean, they're just walking around at the fair. And some of this that we see, it's just sad to see what people have done. It's like they have deliberately tried to make themselves look awful. That's dishonoring the body. Put body piercings in there. I know there's different kinds of body piercings too. And my opinion on that may not necessarily match yours, but I know too, there's body piercings, and you know this, that just dishonor the body. That's what happens when we turn away from God. We dishonor ourselves. And some have done it by the way their body appears. Others have done it with what they've done to their bodies. They dishonor their bodies between themselves. They're using their bodies in ways that God never intended. And in ways even you don't see the animals do. Now, they change the truth of God into a lie. They will tell you, they'll tell you things that they don't believe God, and they'll imagine their own God, and they'll take the things that are true about God, and they'll say that's a lie, and then they'll hold up a lie as though it is the truth. And then it says they worship and serve the creature more than the Creator. Now, Paul here saying that he puts a little praise in here. The creature who's blessed forevermore. Amen. That's the Creator, but they're worshiping the creature. I was talking to my little class this morning. There are some people that are more interested in saving the whales and saving the polar bears than they are saving their neighbor. And yeah, we want to look out at nature, and we don't want to purposely damage nature and protect it, but some have taken this whole idea of saving the earth into their religion. And they're more interested in the environment and the earth than they are of God. And it's like they worship the creation and leave God out of it. So God gives up. God gave them over to vile affections. We're going to talk about later here tonight those who lack natural affection. We know what it is to have affection. That feeling of love and desire for something that is good. But people turn those feelings of things of love for that which is good and love that which is evil and wicked and depraved. Vile afflictions. And then it says, even their women did change the natural use of that which is against nature. And likewise the men, leaving the natural use in the women, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly. He's talking about old Rome. It sounds like he might be talking about our own culture, though, doesn't it? Have you ever seen such gender confusion that is out in this world? And people doing things that are so unnatural because they don't like the idea of God having a Godhead, having authority. They'll show God, and they're going to be who they're going to be, and defy God, and it's not going to work for them. I've heard it said, it's just another sin. We all sin. One sin's like another sin. Every city in the world was filled with sinners when God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Some sins are more depraved than others. And Paul is talking about how depraved man can become when he leaves God out of his thoughts. And this is what he turns to as the extremity of depravity. This frightening thing. When you see people glorying in this kind of activity, it's not just they are giving up on God. God's giving up on them. It says they receive in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. I tell you, there's consequences. There's consequences to this kind of behavior. Mental, there's physical, mental, and especially spiritual consequences. And they're going to suffer those consequences. God gave them up to a reprobate mind. Let me tell you what that word reprobate mind means. It means they no longer are able to distinguish between right and wrong. They cannot think through and determine something that is good or evil. They've got it all mixed up. They might even say, well, there's really no concept of good or evil. That's just something culturally imposed upon us. And they can't think it through and understand what's right and wrong anymore. A reprobate mind. Why did they have a reprobate mind? They don't have God in their knowledge. They take God out. If you take God away, where is ethics? Where is morality? What's the basis for it? And they can't tell right from wrong anymore. So God gives them up. Okay, have a reprobate mind. See where that's going to get you. They didn't like to retain God in their knowledge. God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. And then it talks about these sins. Now, in these verses, I count 23 sins. Let me read them, and then we're going to go over some specifically. Being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity. That's 10. Whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers. That's 20. And then natural affection, implacable, and unmerciful. Well, I count 23. You want to know what wrong is? We've got a list of it right here. It's not the only list. There's several of these lists in the Scriptures where God just says, okay, let me name some of them for you. And He lists them out. He spells it out. See, we're without excuse. God has revealed to us the kind of behavior He says is unacceptable, it's ungodly, it's unrighteous. Now, let me list it out for you. And that's not the total list. There's other lists out there, but you get the idea real quick. He also lists about good behavior, and there's lists like that. So let's pay attention to that list. One of the first ones mentioned here is fornication. And that's what he's been talking about through this chapter. He's going to go on to other things. But there were so many fornications and so many ways to commit fornication in that culture. And there is in our culture. I've got a book at home called Sailing the Wine-Dark Seas. Now, it's a book about Greek culture. And I've read other books about Greek culture that I enjoyed. And those books mention the depravity of the Greeks. But when I picked up this book, it went page after page after page after page of how depraved those Greeks were. And I just quit reading the book. It was just making me sick. It's in their art. It's on their pottery. It's in their temples. All kinds of ways to act out depraved things, and that was their culture. And that was the Roman culture. They admired the Greeks, and then they picked that up and did that themselves. And the Romans, they always tried to outdo the Greeks. And so you could write a book like that about the Roman culture too. And so you talk about something that was culturally incorrect. That's what Paul's talking about here. I just want us to remember the gospel went out to that culture. And people heard the gospel and found out there was an escape from these things and took the way out. Found something more glorious. And that's what the gospel can do today in the depraved cultures of today. He goes on. We talk about wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity. There, I want to do this. Whisperers and backbiters. Did you hear about so-and-so, what they were doing? Did you know? Oh, yeah, people think he's a good person, but did you know about it? And they'll whisper. And what are they doing? They're trying to tear somebody up and tear somebody down. And a lot of these whisperings are not even the truth. It may be based on a little partial knowledge of something and it's blown out of proportion, and they don't know the story, but they'll whisper about it to try to destroy someone. And then backbiters. You did that to me. Wait till you see what I do to you. And people get that. I'll tell you, the trouble with getting even. You never feel like you get even until you get a little better than even, do you? It's got to be a little worse to them than they did for you to feel justice about that, doesn't it? Backbiters. And then haters of God. They didn't want God in their knowledge, and they hate God. That's why they're acting this way. You want to know why they don't come to church? It's because they hate God. They don't want God in their knowledge. This despiteful, proud boasters, I've always kind of associated that together. It just sounds like they're almost building on that person. Pride, does that ring the bell? Proud. Boasting about things they ought to be ashamed. And they say it's pride. Inventors of evil things. I'm reminded of the days of Noah when man's heart was only evil continually. And they have done things we read in the prophets where God said, I never even thought they would do such things. And yet today, with the advance of technology, men still find ways to use good things and turn it into something evil. You see that, don't you? With the emails and the internets and the Facebook and things that in and of themselves are neither good nor evil, but people find a way to use those things for evil that they hadn't even thought of before, and they invent new ways to commit old sins. Disobedient to parents. I remember when I was a little boy growing up, that put the fear of the Lord in me. You better, listen, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And we can talk about little children, and I know they got to be taught to obey their parents. But when they're not, they taught to rebel against authority. And this disobedience to parents doesn't end with children. It goes on into adulthood where they have no regard for their parents, and they do not honor their parents, and they'll take advantage of their parents, and they will abandon their parents. And it's a breakdown of the home when this occurs. Covenant breakers. It says without understanding, but covenant breakers. They don't keep their word. They don't keep their promise. That's what a divorce is. Someone's broken the covenant, and they put away their husbands. and they put away their wives that they promised that they would love. But something went wrong. And so they feel like, well, I'm going to break that covenant. Or maybe they're unfaithful. They promise to be faithful and they're not faithful. And they break the covenant. That's the one reason God says you can in that marriage. But the reason there's plague of divorce in the land is because of covenant breakers without natural affection. Can we talk about abortion? Where a mother, for her own life and her own sake and her own pleasure and her own desires, will kill her own children? Is there no natural affection for that? And it seems unthinkable that women would do this. And others, there's just things that just seem natural. You'd be naturally want to have that affection. And yet children neglecting their parents and parents neglecting their children. And don't have that natural affection they should have toward one another. Implacable, unmerciful. And now listen, who knowing the judgment of God that they which commit such things are worthy of death. Now it does not say you need to go kill them. No, don't read that. It's not for us to go kill them. God's the one that says they're worthy of death. And death comes as a consequence of sin. That's why death is in this world. And we'll be studying that later when we get into Romans chapter 5. But this justifies God. Those who commit such things are worthy of death. But there's one more thing here. Well, I don't do that. I don't do that stuff. That's not me. But it's fun to watch. But have pleasure in them that do them. See, they're worthy of death too. Let your own conscience come to you now. What entertains you? Does sin entertain you? Is that what you like to see and to read and to hear about sin? Are you having pleasure in them that do those things? Do you defend their right to do this? Do you come to their defense in the manner in which they live? Then you're guilty too. God says you're worthy of death too. Now that sounds hard. That just sounds too hard. But okay, understand the wrath of God. And God's justified in His wrath against sin. Now that is a most sobering chapter, but it's not over. And we're going to get into those who think they're better than this and they're so self-righteous, but we're going to hold that for the next time. That'll begin in chapter 2. So just tremble and beware that there's more to come. We don't want to have to experience the wrath of God. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And we don't have to experience God's wrath. Paul is writing Romans to let us know that we can escape that wrath. That the gospel has shown us that God's made a way for us to escape that for which we are worthy, and we can get out from under that and find forgiveness and grace and mercy and freedom from sin because of what Christ has done to pay that price. And that's revealed in the gospel. And so you need to respond to the invitation and take advantage of God's grace. Turn from sin confess your faith, be baptized into Christ, and live, as Paul said in Romans 1:1, live as His servant, live as His slave. Give everything over to Him and live for Him and not yourself. And you have the freedom from this. And God is pleased. And now He can bless you as He wants to do. If you need to respond to the invitation, then do it while we stand and sing.